luckily, that's what we're going to spend our first bit of time on, is a presentation from a staff member in the Regional District of Nanaimo. I wanted to take some time to share what I think is excellent work and what we do in this region. We have specifically chosen to do a parcel tax that funds and supports the work that we call the Drinking Water and Water Protection, or Watershed Protection Program. And although that program is fairly broad and does a lot, I'll do my best to provide a bit of a summary before I introduce Erica. The program essentially studies the region's water resources, so heavily, science-based, and then supports stewardship efforts, offers education and outreach programming, and then, core, I think, is also supports informed policy and decision making that integrates that long-term health of our water resources in our planning applications. So from my perspective, and one of the reasons I very much value this work, is if we're going to be making land use decisions, it needs to, and Don, I'll acknowledge you here on this, it needs to be rooted in water availability. And so I know that there's some areas that have had some challenges with water. So I wanted to share that the work that we're doing with the DWWP program. And very grateful for Erica, not only because she's a fabulous person and we get to have her in our region, but she's willing to share her knowledge today. Erica Forsman coordinates the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Program, which, as I said, monitors stewardship, education, monitoring, and then policy advocacy throughout our region. She has a background in both natural resources and communication, with over 10 years experience working with community groups and regional governments. She specializes in place-based community stewardship and education that highlights sustainability, local drinking water, source and infrastructure, and stream system ecology. So thank you, Erica. I'm happy to have you here. What we're going to do today is have a presentation from Erica, and then if you don't mind saving questions till the end, and we'll have some time at the end for any questions that you might have about this program that we offer here. So Erica, thank you for your time, and I'll leave it to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jessica, and thanks so much for the invitation to speak to you all today. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. I've got some slides to run through to kind of guide the conversation. One second. Can you all see that?
That looks good.
There we go. Fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Very kind. And yes, I've been with the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Program here at the Regional District of Nanaimo for coming up on 2 years now. So really happy to be in this role and sort of leading the broad sort of objectives that our program tries to achieve. And I'll just start with a bit of a territorial acknowledgement. So the lands that we work on and the watersheds that we work within in the Regional District of Nanaimo are located within the territories of the Nanaimo, the Snowis, and the Qualicum First Nations. And I think it's really important in acknowledging how we talk about water and the land, and acknowledging the original stewards of the land and incorporating their knowledge into the programs that we run. So just a little bit of an overview of where I'm going to take you through today. And it's kind of nice. We actually have a small group. So I did ask Jessica to ask everyone to hold their questions till the end. But honestly, it's not too many of you. If you guys kind of want to jump in and ask questions as I'm rolling through stuff, that's totally fine. Sometimes it's just hard to see hands on the screen as you're kind of going through slides, but no problem at all. So I'm just going to set a little bit of a context for sort of where we're situated, sort of some watershed thinking in terms of how we look at the land, and then provide a bit of a basis for what the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Program is all about. And then I'll go into talking about what we kind of refer to in this program as our data to action cycle. So it sort of incorporates all of our program areas, but it really looks at how we are monitoring and collecting information, with our water resources, but how we actually action that into some positive change in both in terms of how we look at water quality, water movement, water quantity on the landscape. And then I'll go into some of the applications of that data in terms of looking at some of our seasonal water reporting that we do, and some of our water budget studies and aquifer vulnerability assessments, and speak to how that can kind of be applied through a lens of rainwater management. So yeah, I'll get started here. So just kind of setting the context for the regional district of Nanaimo. So I think it's important here to sort of understand where we're situated, what our watersheds look like. So as with many coastal communities that you all represent, our watersheds are relatively short in terms of the distance from mountaintop to sea. And this means that we can have often quite flashy streams, but this means that we have incredibly rich and diverse aquatic ecosystems. And this is something that we really see resonating in our communities in terms of how people connect to these places. We also have incredibly complex groundwater aquifers. So these are overlaying both bedrock aquifers and sand and gravel aquifers, and understanding and mapping them is quite a complex, both an art and a science. But in terms of thinking about how to manage them, it's really good to sort of understand what we're actually dealing with. We also have within the regional district of Nanaimo a multitude of community water systems. So in terms of provision of drinking water, many residents within the regional district rely on groundwater resources for their drinking water. And these are purveyed through various water service providers, such as municipalities, also improvement districts. We also have a private water purveyor, EPCOR, that operates in sort of the central part of the region here in the French Creek area, and then many small private systems and many private domestic wells. So it's quite a mosaic of various ways that people access their drinking water. I'll also say that our region is, the upper watersheds, a little bit unique in terms of most of them are private managed forest land. So it's not a lot of crown land in those upper watersheds. So it's private timber companies that manage those upper watersheds. And then as you move down into the central parts of the watersheds, we see a lot of agricultural producers and rural landscapes. And then it's really in those lower watersheds that we see our urban and suburban interface. And I will say that all of these areas are experiencing climate change and the various effects of it. And we're really seeing the effects on those water resources. So in that, I think it's important to acknowledge that we have many overlapping water jurisdictions within the regional district of Nanaimo, and a question often comes up. We hear this from residents all the time of who manages water. And as you kind of may know, the very short, simple answer to that is like, well, the province legislatively. But we all know that's far more complicated than that, in terms of like water allocation and licensing. Yes, that's often managed by the province, but then fish habitat is managed by Department of Fisheries and Oceans. If we look at how water is flowing in terms of drainage and roads, we're looking at municipalities, but also Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. And then, of course, municipalities and regional districts play a very heavy hand in terms of looking at land use planning and regulation. So it really is a complex landscape when you're looking at the overlapping jurisdictions of who's managing water. And I will actually go back and say that this graphic doesn't even dive into sort of the private management of water, but also First Nations rights over water, stream keepers, private landowners. So it really is quite a multitude of players in the game. So this is really why the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Program was established. And as Jessica kind of introduced, it was established through a parcel tax, a bylaw back in 2008. So this enables us to have some long-term capacity funding so that we can make plan over decades in terms of how we allocate resources to this program. And the intent here was really to address that need for better water information, to inform local decisions, and that need, as I mentioned, to coordinate across jurisdictions. So in terms of the program goals, really, what we're looking to do in the drinking water and watershed protection is largely around facilitation and support. So we're looking to protect and manage, restore ecosystems, safeguarding drinking water supply. We look at a lot of sort of water use efficiency and optimizing infrastructure, reducing use of water. We also are all about fostering enjoyment and protection of water, looking at it through a socio-cultural, recreational lens. And then, of course, integrating the impacts of climate change and providing some resiliency across the region as we're faced with real stark changes through climate change in our hydrological cycles. So how the program operates, we're overseen by a technical advisory committee. And this is, some broad representation. You can kind of see on this side of the screen some of the representatives we have on this committee. And this is really about convening a lot of different folks at the table when we have conversations about water. The purpose of this committee is really to, inform staff on the direction of the program. But as I said, it's an opportunity to bring folks to the table, share expertise, provide a venue for project collaboration, really talk about that sort of alignment of objectives and to share resources. So back in 2020, we updated our action plan and really articulated through this action plan sort of 3 distinct program areas that we focus our attention. So this kind of can be overarchingly defined as looking at water awareness and stewardship, water information and science, and then water-centric planning and policy support. And I'll just note through here, this is so important, this sort of river that runs through all of these is this idea of water collaboration. And sometimes I really think about reorganizing this visual to show where it's actually a Venn diagram and how all of these program areas actually overlap and support each other. But just for the purposes of project planning and program strategic alignment, we kind of look at them as these sort of distinct areas. And in terms of what we're doing in those distinct areas, in water awareness and stewardship, it's really about education and outreach in our community. We have a very strong presence in the community through what we call Team Water Smart, sort of boots on the ground program that's going out and doing a lot of interface with the public, but also looking at how we can, incentivize sustainable practices. So we have a well-established rebate program to really try to reduce those barriers, those financial barriers for residents in implementing sustainable water practices on their properties. But then going into water information and science and water-centric planning and policy support. And that's where I'll kind of jump in here to kind of explain how those 2 pieces are very interconnected. So we had this infographic kind of developed through one of our community watershed monitoring network data sharing sessions where we kind of bring a lot of members of our stewardship community together. And really it's about hearing from them what they're doing in terms of water data collection, restoration activities, things like that. But how it connects kind of back to that broader picture. So this is kind of how we try to define that data to action cycle in the programming that we do. So action, as it's sort of defined through our community watershed monitoring programs, feed into various programs and initiatives. And so things like, stream restoration and enhancement programs, the prioritization of where we can implement green infrastructure. It also helps target where education and outreach would both be best leveraged across the region, but also ties into sort of how we can support planning processes in terms of development review processing, licensing and permitting, and also the establishment of best practices. And we really do see this as a cycle because all of this actually has to come back to engagement and working with community members where we can then sort of calibrate and inform what we're doing. We can identify where those gaps are. We can refine what data needs to be collected. We can understand the responsibility of who leads certain projects, and then that moves back into all sorts of different water data collection. So within our program, we do have these sort of different nodes of data collection that we focus on. But for the purposes of sort of talking to you all today, I'm going to focus mostly on our stream flow and hydrometric monitoring as it pertains to our groundwater monitoring programs. But if you have any questions at all, I'm happy to speak more in depth on some of our other monitoring nodes that we oversee. So our volunteer observation well network is kind of how we head off our groundwater monitoring programming. So how do we actually go about collecting groundwater data across the region? So the volunteer observation well network was really established to expand data collection beyond what we see with the provincial observation well network. As you know, the province does a great job actually across the whole province monitoring what's happening in various aquifers. But as you can see here on the map, you know, the green triangles, those are the provincially managed observation wells, which we find, you know, they do have fair coverage, but they're not really extended enough to really adequately capture the level of detail that we feel is necessary to support some of those more granular technical studies that we want to look at. So through this program, we partnered with private landowners who rely on their wells for their drinking water, and we installed monitoring equipment, or what we call pressure transducers, in their wells. And so these transducers, they record well levels every 15 minutes, and that data is then downloaded by our staff about 4 times per year. It can then be uploaded into a data visualization kind of app that can be accessed either by our consultants who go on to do further technical studies, but also for those volunteer well operators. So they are kind of getting something out of the program in terms of a better understanding of their well and its health as well. So 14 of the loggers that we have, they also measure conductivity, which is an indicator for saline intrusion. So, you know, being representatives from coastal communities, this is certainly something that comes to the forefront when we think about sea level rise, but also increased pumping rates. So really important to have that measurement also kind of being recorded on some of these observation sites. So the monitoring well volunteers began, this was started in the spring of 2013 with expansions up until now. We're kind of at our capacity right now, but it sort of depends on sort of where we go next with some of our technical studies. And I will note that it takes about 5 to 10 years of data collection to really be able to discern some of those long-term trends in terms of the information that's gathered. So question, what does this actually feed into? So we've got all this data, but what are we doing with it? So one example of that is we put together an annual pre-summer groundwater level analysis report. So since 2020, the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Program has completed this annual regional analysis of groundwater levels, which can support preparation for the summer period ahead. It really provides an update on some of the longer term, but also seasonal trends observed in aquifers in the region. So for example, last year, in our 2024 analysis, this actually included 61 wells in total. So that's both our about 27 RDN volunteer observation wells, 34 provincial observation wells, which really gives us a lot of breadth in terms of understanding going into that drought season, sort of how to prepare for seasonal droughts, kind of knowing where we are going into it. So again, this provides a bit of a snapshot heading into the summer months. And those seasonal conditions that we do observe in the springtime that can be reported through this just provide that early indication for water service providers across the region, as well as residents who are in private domestic wells, about what water conservation measures might be needed as we go into these summers where we're seeing longer and more extreme droughts. So again, these reports are shared with municipal water providers, small water system staff, improvement districts, and then it can really help us calibrate drought response. So next, a little bit more sort of zoomed out long-term thinking of what we can do with some of that groundwater data. So, you know, I just sort of shared sort of a short-term data to action cycle of how we can kind of use that information to provide some action on the ground. But this is a bit more of a larger project. So the Regional District of Nanaimo's water budget project, it's a multi-phase series of studies that's really looking to examine the relationship of surface water to groundwater. It's looking at projection of future water demands, as well as the long-term impacts of climate change on water resources. And I'll note this is really at a regional scale. And what this project is trying to do is aim to assist land and water managers in balancing those competing water needs and land land practices with what we understand are finite water supplies, as we couple both surface water and groundwater together. So just to explain this visual a little bit, this is sort of a high level kind of concept of what we do in water budgeting, is we're looking at, all of those groundwater inputs. So these are things like precipitation, it can be snow melt, also looking at sort of the lateral movement of water from those mountain block reservoirs as that water moves very slowly underground to the sea. And then we look at the discharge, so all the outputs, and these are both anthropogenic outputs, but also natural outputs. So, things like municipal well fields and private utilities, the human extraction of water, but also that discharge into creeks. It's looking at where that surface water and groundwater connection is happening, and where groundwater is feeding stream systems, which is so darn important again in these drought seasons where cool groundwater moving into stream systems is providing better habitat for aquatic ecosystems.
You just grab the rest of your stuff, is that okay?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So this kind of arrives at an annual water budget. So I did mention this is, a multi-year, multi-phase analysis. So phase one was really broad regional overview. This was done back in 2013. And it really showed and highlighted where some areas in the region are experiencing, more variability in water supply, experiencing the impacts of climate change in a more extreme way, and also showed us where we could see potential issues around saltwater intrusion or potential agricultural use pressures. Phase two was around in 2015, 2016, where we looked at where there were some data gaps, and then we tried to fill some of those gaps. So it was installation of some additional volunteer observation wells and additional hydrometric monitoring, such as lake level monitoring in key parts of the region. And now we're in phase three of the project, where we're looking to develop three-dimensional numerical groundwater flow models, where this can be used to actually simulate scenarios. So we're looking at scenarios around projected climate change, build out, and also increased or decreased water use pressures. And this is really going to help us understand water availability and constraints. And this can then be used as a working tool to assess stress on aquifers and watersheds, really comparing that availability with water use. So again, the findings of this analysis is really going to help guide regional scale recommendations for water supply planning and water use decisions. So just looking at areas in the region where we have targeted for those phase three studies. So in 2020, we completed a study of the Nanaimo area. So we call that Water Region 5A. Just last year, we completed a study of the French Creek Water Region. This is a very jurisdictionally water use complex part of the region. And we're currently in progress for Director Stanley's area, Area A, for the Cedar Yellow Point Cassidy Water Region. So that project has started, and we're hoping to sort of complete it by the end of this year. So in terms of the intended use of these models, so they are very much regional in scale, and they look at a full water region and those overlapping aquifers, really trying to predict overall water balance in the study areas. And I should note that aquifers are not homogeneous, depending on a specific area of interest, they could react to pumping in different ways. So it's important that, these are regional in scale from our granular looks at sort of how well fields may react to more pumping. That does require a different style or a different type of technical analysis. And also, this is an ongoing project. So the intention here is as more data becomes available, we can update these models that we're building every sort of 5+ years and apply new information to them. So, as new climate projections come out, as new OCPs come out with potential for build out, this can be applied to the model and it can help us sort of refine the outlook for the future. So in terms of actioning the study results, so this is sort of looking at the French Creek Water Region water budget, for example. So some of the outcomes of this the recommendation that we really saw in this one was that the RDN and government partners really consider the results of the water balance analysis to help to identify and target areas for groundwater conservation and better water management programs, particularly in areas where it was predicted to have the most effective climate change. Water was to have the most effect from climate change and land use change. So, for example, looking at things like where we could implement stormwater management programs and just to support aquifer recharge where that new development might be planned. So it's really about how we can inform planning policies, looking at updates to official community plans, developing development permit areas for aquifer protection, and also informing regional water supply planning and provincial water allocation decisions. I'll note that a lot of these water budget studies that we've worked on have very much been in close partnership with water, land, and resource stewardship in the province. So they can use these technical studies as well as they roll out the updated Water Sustainability Act in terms of some of that groundwater allocation planning that they do. So where does this sort of connect to some of our other planning actions? So really looking at things like the regional strategy for rainwater management, and we can see this as a bit of sort of like a vehicle for action through these water budget studies. So the regional strategy for rainwater management, this was completed in 2022, and we're in the implementation phase of that right now. Can be used as a way to sort of outline policies, bylaws, design standards, things like that, that can really be strategic around guidance to address groundwater recharge. And within this strategy, there's recommendations for water budget and water balance modeling that can inform policy decisions. And it works to really draw the lines between those technical studies and where that can inform some policy. So in terms of rainwater management, what does it do? It looks at the maintenance of groundwater recharge for community water supply. So as mentioned, many residents in our region do rely on groundwater for their community water resources. But it also considers ecological health as how that water actually flows into our stream systems and supports aquatic health. So really effective rainwater management, it's important to emphasize that it enhances climate resilience. As I mentioned earlier, flood and drought cycles are becoming more severe. And I think in speaking about kind of how we go forward in terms of climate resilience, it's a changes in hydrological cycles and how we can really build resilient communities around that is a very forward-thinking approach to thinking about climate resiliency. So embedded within the regional strategy for rainwater management, definition of how we look at rainwater management, we really tried to shift the terminology from stormwater management to including all aspects of the water cycle, including drought events, including snowmelt. But it's really about protecting the natural water balance and health of watersheds in terms of, that groundwater recharge that we see in those water budget studies, around mitigating flooding, protecting water quality, and enhancing climate resilience. And it really asks about, how we manage precipitation on the landscape, using both natural ecosystems and also built infrastructure. And it really is looking at water management rainwater management on that sort of watershed scale. So I won't go through this too much because I know I'm kind of running out of time and you guys would like to discuss, but in terms of those strategy objectives, so it's really about creating a foundation for collaboration across the region. The strategy emphasizes the requirements to really coordinate across those jurisdictions. So that slide I showed earlier of that complex water jurisdictional landscape that we're embedded in, it's really about how do we work between those lines to coordinate how rainwater moves across the landscape and where it can be directed to, and how to essentially sink, slow, and spread the direction of water on the landscape. And within the rainwater management strategy, the structure of recommendations that really come out, many of these are underway through things like our water budget studies, watershed monitoring that's underway. We recently did complete a regional climate change assessment, and then looking at the development of performance targets. So this really looks at, specifically, we recently developed performance targets in the French Creek water region that do try to address that question of how do we slow the movement of water on the landscape and how do we recharge those aquifers. And these targets were proposed for this part of the region, but acknowledge that they can be used as interim targets across the region to really begin implementing those broader policies around how development is enacted to maintain some of those pervious surfaces and direct water in a way that maintains the quality of it. So an example of this is the current development underway of an aquifer protection development permit area. So this is already established in some parts of our region, but monitoring, as I mentioned, technical studies, and some of that future scenario modeling that includes climate change projections and land use considerations can really help us begin to target from that regional lens of where to implement stronger aquifer protection areas. So in areas where monitoring and modeling studies have shown vulnerability in regional aquifers, things like DPAs have been developed or are in the process of being developed to protect both the quantity and quality of the water in that part of the region. So this really does bring together rainwater management targets that consider the flow of water on the landscape, and as I mentioned, that aim of slow sinking and spreading water to sort of replicate those natural processes while replenishing those aquifers. And some of the points in here in terms of the anticipated sort of outcome of these aquifer development permit areas are really about reducing that risk of depleted water supply and promoting water conservation on the landscape. So I'll just actually end here because I wanted to circle back kind of to the beginning in terms of how all of our program areas do fit together. And this is a little bit top of mind. This is a publication that just got mailed out to residents this week. I think it's hitting mailboxes today. So it's really, again, about that cycle of how we look at, I know I can see you trying to look closely at it. Don't worry, you're going to get one in your mailbox. But it's really about how we look at that full cycle of, we're doing monitoring on the landscape, we're analyzing that data that we have, but then how does that actually go back into informing policy, but also support for that policy. And a really big part of our program is how we enact that communication. So this publication, Groundwater Connections, it's being sent out to about 36,000 households across the region right now, folks on groundwater as their primary water resource. So it's basically everyone who's not within the city of Nanaimo who rely on surface water for their drinking water. And really the intent of this publication is to communicate monitoring, sorry, I'm losing my voice here, monitoring results and highlighting some of those trends. So embedded in this little magazine, we're showing people what aquifer they're sitting on top of, what the trend is for their aquifer, but then we actually go a little bit deeper. So I kind of featured this little page spread here because what we've done here is we've teased out of the data 4 little stories about groundwater connections for people. And one of those stories tells a story about climate change and how we can track the effects of climate change in our local aquifers. And the graph that you're looking at here actually goes all the way back to the 1980s and how we can see some aquifers dipping as we see changes in precipitation and the ability for those aquifers to actually seasonally recharge. And we're trying to tell these stories in an accessible way so that people understand really their connection to it. Another story that we've pulled out of there, for example, tells a story about saltwater intrusion on a local aquifer and what the reasons for that are, and tries to tease out the science so that people can understand, higher pumping, sea level rise can actually render your private domestic well unusable because of salt water entering into it. So really, effective communication of these monitoring results and explaining the trends, I think, is really crucial for increasing that overall, water literacy of our residents. And this really does, I think, tie back to conversations around policy, because as decision makers, try to have an aquifer DPA kind of implemented, it's very hard to do that if the literacy of residents is not at a place where they understand the significance of that and how that affects the long-term resiliency of the resources that they rely on. So publications like this and our education and outreach really are in place to sort of bolster that ability for us to better manage these resources more broadly out into the future. So I'll leave it there. I kind of put this this here as my last slide. If you want to sort of dive back into sort of thinking about that cycle of data to action, and if you had any specific questions about any pieces of our program. And yes, I'm also happy if you have sort of like to send me an email down the road or anything like that around specifics. I'm happy to send reports or how we're going into the details of this as well. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Erica. I have tons of questions, but I'm gonna throw it out to the committee. I'm not sure that I can see everybody. Oh, okay, great. So Tom actually, oh, a little hand shows up. Okay, Tom, your little hand showed up. So let's go ahead and let me know what you got there.
Great, thank you. And I just want to first thank Erica for the presentation and the importance of this type of collaborative information for those of us out in the hinterland, so to speak. And I see that Penny is online here as well. So I'm Tom Steer. I'm with the District of Tofino, counselor with the district. I'm also a board director on the ACRD. So I have Penny here because a lot of the information be relevant to the through the RDN to the Alberni-Clayoquot Regional District. But I did want to touch on some of the issues that the municipalities face that are distinct, and how some of that information may be relevant. And before I start, I just wanted to your first slide on your presentation with the American Dipper on the water ouzel. I was fortunate enough to do a population study out in the Upper Clayoquot Valley in the early 90s. So it was great to see sort of our little friend right on your front cover. And then the other was, I just want a quick plug for, we are going to be having a Biosphere Trust. We'll be having a climate vital conversation out here on the West Coast, and a number of people be invited to that. And many of the objectives of the climate summit that we had last year will be incorporated in that this regional climate conversation. So that's coming up on April 16th here out on the West Coast, and the ACRD has great representation out on that meeting. It'll be out here on the West Coast. I am coming to you from Tloquet First Nation, and they will be hosting on their territory that event. So just specifically around some of the issues that, with Tofino, and you may or may not be aware that we have some water issues out here. We just adopted a water master plan in 2024, and currently in a strategic, I guess, direction. And once again, I'll preface that by saying a lot of our smaller regional districts and municipalities are limited by our capacity in terms of staffing and the actual money that goes along with that. So, I just throw that out there at front. But one of the things that we're challenged by is that ability. Right now, we're in a water feasibility study, our groundwater. We have inflow systems, and climate change is certainly impacting those systems. And it basically, all of the work we do is predicated on that. You mentioned a couple of things in terms of data and monitoring and the work. And one of the things we're finding is it's the quality of the data that we need. So we've been investing in that area, and it's paying off. And those are, once again, you had touched on the long-term data collection that's important. And certainly we have little snapshots in time on a yearly basis, but looking at that overall trends as in terms of our modeling capabilities has been critically important. So I wanted to touch all those things that you had mentioned. And one thing that, I had my little star was around water conservation and those sustainable practices and incentives that you had touched on. And for us, water conservation has always been critically important, but it actually is just a stopgap in some ways, because it won't solve our overall issue that we have in terms of source. But in the interim, we looked, almost like a 20% savings in our water allocations over those summer dry periods. And it does tie in with the education component. And the last piece I'll do before, and this is mostly all comments, I don't have specific questions, but one of the things that in terms of jurisdiction, and one of your early slides, and one of the things that we've found has been critically important, because our source water right now comes from the Tloquet First Nation. And so First Nation jurisdiction is a conversation that in our area is critically important, certainly in the Alberni-Clayoquot Regional District as well. And it is an area where close collaboration and a recognition of the millennial stewardship that has been in our particular area. So when we look at how we allocate resources and capacity, and you touched on parcel tax and all those other ways, but we're in deep conversation in the Alberni-Clayoquot Regional District, I think, as a leader in those conversations with our nations in terms of those stewardship and where we can collaborate on those larger water conservation, as well as the delivery and infrastructure and all of those that are related to that. So I'll stop there and just, Ron, to really thank you for that presentation. And part of, like our summit back in 2024 was the ability to reach out. And I'm hoping, I'm gonna be giving your name to our infrastructure here on the West Coast, just maybe have a conversation on some. We have a notice of motion on a rain conservation incentive. But those are some of the things that, if we don't have to recreate the wheel, it'd be great to be able to reach out to our colleagues in the different RDN or in the RDN. So thank you once again.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I just want to highlight what Tom said, which is, not recreating the wheel. I mean, that's the whole intention of this group, is to be able to share this information so we can, spread the good work across our whole entire island and coastal regions. So I'm glad to hear that's your plan. Goal achieved. We have not tons of time for more questions, so I want to make sure that people get a chance. Wondering if anybody, Justine?
Yes, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. I want what you have. we could use that. And I'm wondering, when the regional districts communicates to residents about water, it's often in the context of restrictions. And so I'm so pleased to see kind of a different kind of communication where it's based on data and history and stories. And have you found that those communications have changed the relationship residents have with water? Like, have you seen a change in consumption habits or how they talk about it? Just any insight on that would be great.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think so many of these programs require almost like a decades looking back on them, sort of because changing sort of social understanding of something does take a lot of time. Back in around 2020, we put together sort of a baseline study to look at freshwater perspectives across the region. So it was like a bit of a baseline analysis of how people related to their water resources and sort of a general understanding of them. And the purpose of that baseline study, is science-based, put together by a consultant that does a lot of these types of public, broad public surveys, was that we can rerun that over time. So we can really look at, if our programs and the targeted communication we're doing is having an overall influence. So I think that's one approach. Another approach, though, that we really do find is just sort of because we are situated as a regional district, we have this sort of unique ability to really partner with our member municipalities. And what that means is that we can kind of have almost a brand across the municipalities where there's this recognition that people see Team Water Smart out in their communities. They know this is a resource that they can go to. They know who they can contact to answer questions, and we can kind of become that hub of communication for people. And I think that really helps, especially as we look at that sort of, mosaic of water purveyors across the region, overlaid with all those different sort of hydrogeological and stream and watershed diversities that we have, where if people know that there is this sort of common resource they can go to with targeted and easy messaging that they can understand, I think it does build a much more sort of robust ability to get information out there and establish that trust with people. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but sort of in a few different ways. And then I will say, because of that, I'll say for example, the city of Nanaimo has noted that they don't actually have to implement water restrictions necessarily anymore. It's sort of this like this groundswell of information that comes out across the region, and then before the watering restrictions are even implemented in that particular municipality, they already see a taper off of water use during drought season. So I'll use that as an indication that yes, it's working, but it will take years to kind of understand whether that sort of overall water literacy has really been built up. But yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go a little bit long. Donna's got a question, and I want to make sure that I get one in as well. But since we have a smaller group today, I'm going to go a little bit long on here because I think we won't need so much time in the check-in time. So, Donna.
Yeah, thanks. What Justine said, but also I just wonder if you could elaborate a little more on aquifer protection DVPs. You know, what are the pros and cons? Because I find that although, you know, we may set good policy, our ability to enforce anything is very limited. And that's particularly true with covenants. They're not useful as far as I can see. But how about DVPs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for aquifer protection DPA, so we had an aquifer protection DPA established for the Yellow Point aquifer. Jessica, you might be able to jump in the year that was. I think it was around 2013 that was established. And what that requires is that when we see proposals for development, rezoning, or subdivision, we require residents to submit a professional hydrogeological assessment that looks very specifically at the wells that will be drilled on their property and assesses sort of what the pumping rates are of those wells. And in establishing some of that, we really did try to push the envelope a little bit past what was considered kind of the regular sort of domestic use of a domestic well. So kind of accounting for climate change considerations and changes in recharge of those aquifers. So I think we now require people to be able to pump 3.5 cubic meters per day. So it's quite a large amount of water we're requiring of them. And if they can't meet that requirement, we do require them to submit proof of well pumping as well. So there's a few kind of there's sort of doors they have to go through to have that development approved. And then embedded in some of those development permit area requirements is requirements for things like rainwater harvesting systems to be developed on a site when it's being redeveloped. So saying that, we acknowledge that this area is experiencing aquifer vulnerability. Well, let's try our best to implement, when we are doing development on a site, a reduction in the amount of water that might be used there, particularly in those drought seasons. So those are some of the pieces that we can use within that. And what we've really tried to do in as we're developing this new aquifer protection DPA is also incorporating those pieces around rainwater management. So asking people to show us if they're meeting those targets around how much water is retained on site and is actually going to sink back into the ground, instead of those issues around having it just sort of run off. We especially see this in these, atmospheric river events that we have, where you just see so much water moving off the landscape so quickly, and it doesn't actually have time to recharge that aquifer. So these are these sort of like longer term issues that we're going to be facing. So wherever possible, if we can implement these sort of these DPAs and requirements of people when they are doing redevelopment of their land, the intention there is that, over time we have sort of broader resiliency across the landscape because we have more robust development that can deal with those fluctuations in the hydrological cycle. Does that kind of answer your question, Donna? I know there's a few layers to it, and it is challenging, I think, in terms of ensuring that, if you implement a water harvesting system, that the second owner of that house actually uses it, right? And there's always those sort of pieces of it that are a challenge. But I think, if they are built, the intention is hopefully people will use them. So. Yeah,
it is a challenge. Ministry of Transportation, when they approve development, they may require a stormwater management plan, but they never check back to see if it's implemented. So there is absolutely no enforcement.
Yeah. this is something that, you know, in our drinking water and watershed protection program, is a constant challenge in terms of how we bring people to the table as well. So you saw that list of folks who are on our technical advisory committee. The intention is there that we have a seat available for somebody from the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. And then through the implementation of our rainwater management strategy, we also have a rainwater working group with the intention is there's someone from MODI there as well. So the idea is to kind of cross those lines of communication across jurisdictions so that we're all speaking the same language and have a common understanding of the issues so we can move forward through that.
Thanks. Penny, I'm not sure. Penny put a question in the chat. I noticed some of us are having some connectivity issues, so I think I'll just ask it. And if we could just answer like really quick. Sorry, Erica, we could talk forever for this. And but I want to make sure that we get the last two in, which is Penny's question is, does this data collection include agricultural water use?
Yes and no. It's very hard for us to track agricultural water use, as most agricultural water users are on private wells. We have noted and have contributed to agricultural water budget studies that I think have happened in many districts across Vancouver Island and coastal communities through provincial studies. So when we look at those water budget models that we're building, those agricultural water use models are folded into those. But yeah, that's sort of a long and short answer to say yes, but not really.
Thanks. One last question. You talked, and it's mine. So you talked a bit about how this work and information can influence or be considered when developing OCPs. Can you just give us a little kind of, you know, snapshot of how you see that information affecting the development of OCPs?
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on that a little bit in terms of how we can, you know, incorporate policy within OCPs and in things like forms of aquifer protection, development permit areas. That's something that can certainly be included. But there's lots of other options for development permit areas that can be embedded in OCPs around kind of like tree protection areas. So you're looking at, you know, that reduces evapotranspiration and you know, increases the ability of that groundwater recharge to happen, and also areas around protection around streams. So, you know, we can always do sort of the minimum that's required of us by the province, but there are abilities within the development of those OCPs for us to be bold and push a little bit more, particularly in areas that these technical studies have pointed to do have higher vulnerability. And I think that's always a balance, and I understand that OCPs are trying to strike the balance of, you know, a housing crisis, an affordability crisis, and all these different pieces. But I do think that when we have these really robust monitoring networks and we can point to good data that can feed into that, we can really build that into how we prioritize language in OCPs around environmental protection. So those are sort of some of the tools, but yeah, I don't know if that helps.
It does. Thank you. And thank you, Erica. I always wish I had more time to learn more about this. And in closing, I guess I just kind of want to highlight, you know, we started off at the, you know, more of the scientific data monitoring, but at the end we talked about the work that we do to increase water literacy and highlight how important that is if we want to make these changes or need to take bold action in response to, you know, really significant situations. If we don't have an informed community that understand the need for this, we might end up in a backlash scenario that would undermine the ability to move forward. So very appreciative of, you know, not only educating me and us here today, but the efforts of educating, you know, everyone, at least in our region, about the importance of that. I will also note that I saw on the graphic there was the little cow with the little cow poo, which made me laugh because, you know, all those actions that we take in our land have the potential to influence the water underneath. And so it was a little sad. That's why I laughed, and I was looking forward to see if that actually was. But how informative. Yes, those actions have impact too. So Erica, thank you so much for your time today. And always, but very much appreciate your work that you do.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. And I think you probably have my email address. Feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Happy, as always, to continue the conversation and pass along resources. And I will just end, I think, from all these different communities, I think it's important to note that not everyone should have a drinking water and watershed protection program. There's sort of different fits that work for different groups. So I think important to kind of think about that we can all sort of borrow ideas from each other and make a more robust system going forward. So thank you so much.